and welcome everyone.
All right, sounds great. Thank you, Jackie. Welcome, everybody. Tonight, we are very, very pleased to be joined by Mayor Brian Patterson and Rob Wood. And I'll let you guys do a little quick introduction. But just very briefly, tonight, we're going to talk about kind of what we've experienced along this COVID journey, this crazy journey that we're all in, and discuss some of the lessons that we've learned, the triumphs, how we can support the community moving forward. And really, one of the things is, what have you learned in this time that you want to move forward with? That's one of the great questions that we're having in these discussions, and really some good takeaways that we're able to move forward with. So thank you both for joining us, and Jackie for being here with me. And I'll pass it back over to you, Jackie.
Okay, I'm going to unmute myself. So typically when I'm in a call with these two gentlemen, Rob is facilitating. And he starts it off with throwing it to Brian to start the call. So I thought I'd change everything up tonight. And I thought I'd get you to start, Rob, just to, to catch everybody off guard. And I want to talk to you, Rob, about the group that you've championed. And I feel it's an honor to participate and be part of what were once twice a week and now weekly calls. So I'd like you to tell us a bit about, where that group start, why did it start, who's all participating, and what the desired outcomes are for the group that you're championing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, I'll start, and you can tell your side of the story. I'm sure. So,
that's right. I just thought I'd change it up.
Yeah. Well, the way I recall it beginning, I think that the state of emergency provincially was declared on something like March 17th. And that was a Tuesday, I believe. And then on the Thursday, I was chatting with Brian on another matter, and we got talking about the situation generally and whether we'd have to declare emergency in Kingston. And Brian said, as I recall it, Brian, you said, well, I'm pretty plugged in inside City Hall. What I need is a line of sight on issues as they emerge in the community. Because if we're going to work together, we need to see them early, not after they're kind of a wildfire out of control. And I was pretty on board with that because during going back 20 years to the ice storm, at that time I was general manager for 4 Chum Group radio stations in Eastern Ontario. And I remember from that time, and that was a much smaller kind of challenge, how critically important it was to have accurate information and to have everyone plugged in. And some communities were plugged in and prospered through it pretty well, and others not so well. So I was very keen to try and help Brian. I've always been a big supporter of and fan of Brian's. So I kind of went to my Rolodex because I'm a consultant and I've worked for a long time with a lot of different types of organizations in town, both in the private sector and especially in the social sector, culture and arts, all around, and also through a lot of volunteer groups that I'm on boards and so forth in healthcare and social services, et cetera. And so from Thursday at noon, we kind of went through, invited 50 people for Saturday, and 36 hours, we had 49 people who were ready to be on the call. And at that point, it was a case of people were going like, what the heck is hitting us right now? There was chaos everywhere. And so I think it helped started off on the right foot to be able to kind of get a line of sight of what's happening and all the different sectors coming together. I'll stop there, but Brian may have a different recollection of how that started.
No, it sounds about right, Rob. I certainly remember your comment about how the province had declared, state of emergency on Tuesday, and you could feel everything was shifting around us. Really, I think probably in the few days before that, and it quickly became clear to me that my job was changing, and I had never encountered a state of emergency before. I've been in this position for about 5.5 years, and it was radically changing before my eyes. And I knew immediately that, okay, this is going to take a whole new approach, something that I've never seen before. I remember I even brought in my office staff, and we basically just cleaned everything off the table and basically had to just rebuild our approach from scratch to try to respond. And if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that you surround yourself with good people that you trust, that can advise you and give you give you direction and ideas and ways to be able to respond to, you know, the challenges and situations that you find yourself in. And so Rob, I've always counted Rob as one of those key advisors who I trust and respect greatly. And so I remember that conversation that we had with him, and we were talking, Rob, I think just about just communication. So the importance of communication to the community as a whole, and what does that look like? I think at the time I was, you know, trying to find that forum, that means that I could basically, you know, not just convey information, but also reassure, also bring, you know, the direction, just help people to know that in spite of all the chaos, that there were people that were, you know, working behind the scenes, working to help them, working to reassure that, you know, we're going to work on this, we're going to come up with a plan, and we'll respond. And it was really, I remember in that conversation, Rob, where, you know, we talked about, you know, a way to convene as many people as we could to try to understand what was going on in every sector of the community. And, you know, I remember this keenly. We had our first call on the Saturday, but I'd never used Zoom before. It's funny because I'd never needed a video conference forum. I mean, I always preferred meeting in person, or, you know, we would do phone calls every now and then. So I knew about Zoom, but I had no idea what I was doing. So just quickly adapting to the technology over about a 24-hour period, making sure that I kind of knew what I was doing, and then, yeah, jumped in with a whole whack of people. But it was great. It was really, I came away from that first conversation in a way energized, that so many people were interested in wanting to connect and to share, and I knew that this was going to be a really important tool for us going forward.
And from there, one of the things that we did, I think we settled pretty early between the two of us that it would be short and more frequent, especially in the first early days. Things were changing, you know, in 3 days, it was a new story. And so we settled pretty quickly on a format that would be 20 or 30 minutes long. And we had to keep it under 100 people but you can't have 100 people all presenting and so forth in a 20-minute. So we developed a sort of method of canvassing people who had updates. We stayed focused on what are the emerging issues. And when we developed that as a forum, we didn't kind of come out full blown right off the bat. We knew that we had to develop a habit that people would add. People were adjusting, and we said we have to establish a sort of a media or a meeting habit. And so the first meeting was just a conversation like this. Then the second meeting, I think we added a little quickie poll that you can pop up on Zoom and go. Then in the third one, we added another little thing that was different. I think, Brian, you had to teach for part of it, and you had a little video that we presented. And then we had some slides that we added. And so we just kind of every week for the first 5 or 6 times, we had some little thing that was different each time to keep people interested, and they kept coming back. Our list grew. I think now it's around 88 people. Not all can join every call, but everyone. And when people can't make it, they send sorry notes and apologize. And the other feature we have with our calls, just to wrap up, is that we also do notes. And more recently, especially with my associate and friend, former, while he's still a Globe writer and formerly with the Whig, is Harvey Schachter. And so we now have 30,000 words of notes that have been taken. So after the call, we transcribe the video call, then we send that around to all 80 people. So if you miss a meeting, you can, and it's not exactly verbatim, but pretty darn close. So you're right up to speed with it. And then typically people who say are on the board, Downtown Kingston would be one. You had Tim Peter as a guest on a previous show. So Tim would share that with his board. And Brian, I think you share it with some of your counselors as well to keep everybody in the loop.
Mm-hmm.
There's 88 people and there's a wide range. Can you just highlight, like you talk about sectors, who's all participating in those calls?
Well, I think we cover most sectors. Are there some that stand out in your mind, Brian? And then I can fill in the.
I mean, I think you know, at a high level, Jackie, I think you've got people from, you know, the business community, from your social services agencies, your cultural sector, education sector. It's definitely a broad brush. We even have, you know, municipal representatives. So not just myself, but, you know, representatives from Loyalist Township and surrounding area. We've had emergency services. So the fire chief and the paramedics chief, and obviously our police chief as well. So it's pretty broad brush. I'm not sure if there's a category I'm missing, Rob, but it's basically, really, touching on a whole number of different areas. And you've got your your Rotary groups, you got your kind of like your grassroots community groups, and then your institutional leaders at the other end. And so I think for me, what I enjoyed certainly is the first few calls got underway was seeing the chat and seeing the connections that people were making. And so you'd have somebody that would kind of throw out an issue or a problem, and then other people would be putting in the chat, okay, well, here's some information and this might help you, or I've heard that this would be a good resource, and just the kind of connection. It was really neat to see in real time. And I know that Rob, handling a lot of the administration, was involved in a lot of the email connections, but even just for me being able to watch in real time as people were connecting and forming those bonds and working relationships, it was really great to see. It was like Kingston at its best, right on the Zoom screen as everyone's connecting.
Mhm.
And I would say that in selecting the people, we had a couple of guiding principles. One was that we tried to pick people who wore multiple hats. If it's okay to use a name, like one example would be Wendy Bellamy. She's, has her own business, a business to business. She's the chair of the Partners of Mission Food Bank, and she's also chair of the Kingston Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah.
So you have a business hat, a social service hat, and a personal business hat. I think of another person like Lori French, who is the community manager for the Lynn for healthcare, but she's also a school board trustee and involved with the Community Foundation in Napanee. And so each person that we kind of invited from the beginning, one was somebody who was outside the city. Secondly, was usually not someone that Brian would be talking to every day anyway. Like, we didn't invite Karen Moore because you talk to Karen every day as a medical officer health. And then we look for these triple connections for people. So you can have someone like Peter Merkley, who's president of Rotary, but he's also, involved as on the steering group for Compassionate Kingston, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
Lots of lenses. It's great.
Yeah.
did
great,
we mention
thank-
culture as well? That was one
Yeah.
sector. I wasn't
Yeah,
sure
that
we
was, you did. And yeah, it's definitely a dynamic group of people. So when you think about sort of the navigation, it's moved from twice weekly to weekly because things aren't quite as dynamic as they were at first, and that things aren't quite changing as rapidly. And we've been blessed with such stable health results here. So the emergency part of it is under control in Kingston, but we've had lots of learning. I know as individuals we've all learned, and certainly as the group of people that get together have learned, and the community has learned. So, both of you, whoever wants to start, what do you think are some key pieces that came out of this group and that are learnings that we should be sharing?
I've got a list of 5, Brian. Why don't you go first?
That's a really good question, Jackie. I think what I appreciated about the group was seeing how everyone was grappling with their own unique situations. That no situation was like, obviously the situation that Queens was facing would have been different from your restaurant downtown or a social service agency. So everybody's coming at it from a different angle, and yet everybody's confronted with having to make pretty significant changes, thinking outside the box, trying to understand how do they lead, how do they help those in their sphere, how do they instill confidence into their organization or whatever it is that they're doing in their sphere, and being able to have those honest conversations and feedback. I mean, to be honest, some of those conversations, there were a mix of good things, where people were talking about, we're on this and we're rolling at this program and we're working together and all this great stuff's happening. And some of it was really quite grim, just describing just some of the challenges, for example, like the downtown was facing, for example, and just everyone grappling with those changes and trying to adapt. I think that that's what I appreciated most, because I could identify. And, as, just in my own sphere, trying to adapt and understand how do we learn from each other. So I honestly, Jackie, I would sit with a pad of paper as people would talk, and I would just take notes, just about just the small things that people would talk about how they were communicating with their employees, or how they were communicating with their customers or their clientele, or those sorts of things were really helpful for me, just to try to understand better how to communicate. So for me, I quickly gleaned that communication was the big thing that I needed to focus on. So I essentially, when it came to learning for me, just trying to understand how everybody else was communicating, how everyone else was adapting, and trying to take those creative ideas and approaches and try to use them for my own, and to be able to help convey them to the city as well. So.
Okay. Rob, you said you had a list.
Well, I was reflecting on that, and I have 2 other speaking invitations next week, so I thought I better get going on some of these lessons learned. But one of the things that came from this particular group, I think, and I know from an email that I received after the first or second, and it was from a senior leader in the community. And she said, it's just great to know, it can be lonely when you're leading an organization that's facing a lot of change and a lot of question marks about the future. She said, it's just nice to know I'm not flying alone. And that came out a lot, that sense of almost camaraderie among the group. And that contributes to resilience, I think, whenever you feel that you have other partners and I've got stories that we could get to about how people came together across jurisdictions and boundaries and ways of working to achieve some real successes. But so that was one thing. There was a quote in maybe halfway, like maybe 8 meetings ago, and someone says, the light has been shone on cracks, and now we see where the crevices are. Because, probably this day, which is the day they announced the study on the long-term care and all of that terrible stuff, but that really shows the light. There was a story from education, and they had been planning to do some, online curriculum and so forth. And they found that, the problem really in the end wasn't about devices, it was about access to the internet. And then how others like libraries and others have pitched in to do that. There were a number of different cases, as Tim Pater from downtown Kingston said, we're getting a real look at what's working and what doesn't. And some of that is the old ways that didn't work. But then along with that came, and this is a Laurie French point, she said, many of us are using this as a chance to push past the barriers that we've been kind of wrestling with. She was speaking particularly in terms of online medicine, telemedicine, that type of thing, where there've been a lot of reticence, and maybe we'll have to wait and see how that goes. Now it's like, we got no time, we have no other way. And so we have to push into that type of thing. And so same thing with some business people are saying, boy, the city's never been more welcome to business. We better push for everything we can get right now. So you get that sense of pushing past barriers. Maybe the third thing for now that I'll mention is some people are familiar with the idea of a wicked problem. It's kind of in the literature, and it's defined as the type of problem where not everyone is particular. It's a systems type problem where it's complex. There are a lot of different players. Not everyone agrees on what the problem actually is. Therefore, everyone has a different kind of set of solutions they want to pursue. The common example in the literature would be climate change. Everyone has a different theory of why it is happening, when it happens. I don't think of that only because of this week that we've gone from snow to 100 degrees, but that type of thing. So the strategy in a wicked problem that is best generally is you try something, you monitor closely, you let the rest of the system react, and then you do your next thing and you adjust. And that's not a way that most of us are used to planning. That's not the way we're used to running our agencies or our business. We're used to having a stable environment. We know that if we do this, this will result. And instead, and I've seen a lot of managers and leaders and boards really struggle to get out of the old way of thinking and into this, well, okay, we got to just try something. You know, the community foundation, for one, you know, that they were almost through a grant cycle and said, you know what, the world's changing. We're going to have to like throw out the rule book and get to what's really, really important here. In other cases, some of you may know about the Friends Feeding Friends, which is the program to provide with no frills $100 gift cards for people, especially frontline and retail, who've been laid off before they can get government support from unemployment or whatever. Well, in that case, Greg Davies from the Davies Charitable Foundation and the Community Foundation and a number of other philanthropists, basically over a weekend, pledged and raised $500,000.
Mm-hmm.
But they had to work across that. And so for them, it was a chance to do something and see what happened. Then they needed a delivery partner, but then Dan Irwin and Partners in Mission Food Bank stepped up. And so they were working with that. And then it's, how do we get the word out to the employers? Because they've got to like register their staff with an email. And so then, you know, Downtown Kingston, the Chamber of Commerce, KEGCO, Tourism Kingston, all these groups pitched in to get the word out. So you get this kind of problem solving going on, but it started with, let's try something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been a very different way of working.
Yeah, and I believe, or at least what I've seen, and you've spoken to many different collections of groups, is I believe that it's one of the beautiful things that's come out of a terrible time, is the synergy and collaboration.
Collaboration. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For groups that previously wouldn't have come to the same table. So it's great. And that was mentioned on that last call with Tim Pater, and how grateful that they all were as well to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that it's, you know, I think that the Kingston, you know, works well as a community, even the best of times. But, you know, and everyone will like to say, well, we work together. But I think what I've seen the last 2 months is not just saying we're working together, but no, we're really going to just put titles and history aside and really just fuse together in ways that, you know, I certainly haven't seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really cool. It's been really cool to see that. And you can see it already giving birth to probably new ways of doing things, maybe even some organizational change that probably wouldn't happen with the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, never waste a crisis. You know, it's funny just that sometimes, you know, can create that fertile ground for change. I don't think we've even seen the extent of what that looks like yet.
I would agree. Yeah. And just, it's just something to be so proud of to see our community rally like that and do such great things. And
Mm-hmm.
there's so many examples. And I know, Rob, you have a long list of them. I'd like to just switch the conversation a bit, Brian. And we all know that you said just earlier that your job changed on the 16th or 17th of March when that order was made, and sort of cleaned your desk and said, okay, now I'm going to learn a new job. And we all, you know, we know that you're very experienced in the world of economics and how that lends itself to, you know, managing our community. But all of a sudden this big health issue got thrown into, you know, which no one, like, that's a way different job for a mayor to handle all the stuff of business in a city, and then all of a sudden have to balance economics and health. That's a big deal. And yeah.
You know, it's funny because you know, I've always had a lot of respect for Kieran, and I've had the odd, you know, over the last number of years, had, you know, good meetings with him, and, you know, we've had respect for each other, and we would talk every now and then, usually at budget time when it came to talking about funding for public health, or, you know, the odd health issue that would come up here and again, and to suddenly shift to where, you know, we're talking every day. I'll never forget the phone call that I got from Kieran 1 week before the provincial emergency declaration. He asked if he could have 15 minutes of my time, and I said, sure. You know, I've always got time for him, and I honestly didn't even know what he was calling about. I'm sure I'm happy to take the call. And he basically just started to lay out. He said, just to let you know, this is what's going to be coming for the next year and a half. And I'm going to be honest with you, I was stunned, even though we were still talking about the coronavirus on the news, and it was, you know, it was coming, but it still it really, really hit me. Wow, this is going to change everything. And you know, kind of putting that lens. What's funny though, is that same day after I talked to Kieran, I walked into my economics class at RMC, and we were talking about those shifts that occur where, you know, you can have all this expansion and growth, and then suddenly something hits the economy and, you know, everything falls apart. And we talked about how, you know, it's an inevitability. You know, we've been in the longest expansion of growth. It's only a matter of time before we tip over into a recession. And honestly, we were having a discussion that day about, and I remember my students asked me, what do you think is going to be the next one? And I'm like, well, you know, I mean, it's probably could be soon, but I had no idea. No idea. And less than a week later, that had hit. But, you know, it's funny because I think some people kind of present it as a trade-off. You know, it's either the economy or it's public health. But I think one of the things that I've really learned is how the two really fuse together. The big thing with the economy is confidence, right? Confidence drives everything in an economy. And in order to have confidence, you need good quality people that are running your public health, that are able to communicate, that are able to give advice to businesses and employees and customers so people understand, you know, what they're dealing with, what the realities are, what the precautions are you need to take. And so, to be honest, I think having an economist and a medical doctor with an expertise in infectious diseases working together, maybe that's how, you know, that's the ideal combination. So I know I've learned a lot from him. Maybe he's learned some stuff from me too. I'm not sure, but it's been great working with him.
Oh, for sure.
I think the other part of your job, Brian, is you've also had to deal with the impacts on the municipality.
Yeah, honestly, it's been dramatic, you know, and it's funny because, you know, for a number of years we've had such, and I've worn this badge with pride. I've been so proud of our community about how our transit system has grown, how we have led the country in transit growth. But it's the transit system that has really hit cities hard, because when you lose 90% of your ridership, you know, for obvious reasons right now, that it leaves a huge hole in your budget. And I know that every city, you know, the size of Kingston or bigger in particular, is really grappling with that, and some other revenue losses as well. But it's tough because a lot of people don't know that, you know, we're not like the provincial and federal governments where you can just borrow money at will. If you're running a deficit, we are not allowed to run a deficit. So when we saw those drops in our revenues, our parking revenues and recreational facility revenues, immediately we had to get to work to find ways to cut costs. We had to make some tough decisions, you know, putting off different spending. We've had to lay off employees, you know, gut-wrenching decisions, right, that we've had to manage. And there's probably more that we're going to have to do as well. So it's a challenging situation, because obviously people are still relying on the city to, you know, provide all the services we want to. The last thing that you want to do in a situation like this is have to raise taxes. You know, people are struggling as it is. So you really have to get, you know, really creative and come up with a range of different things that you think will work to keep the city running. But know that, you know, you've got those financial challenges there.
Yeah. About a week ago, we learned how easy it is to have COVID pop up in our community. When somebody, you know, did something simple like, you know, leave and come back and a case. And, you know, as time goes on, this idea of being physically distanced gets harder on all of us. And we have to balance the health of the greater community. And then, you know, there's talk of what kind of impact it's going to have on mental illness, and as more days go by. And for me, I notice it that the accumulation of things you missed happen. You know, you miss going on the trip, you miss that going to see a friend for their birthday, and the list of misses starts to add up, and that the ability to distance can get a little more difficult. And now we've got this thing called summer, and we live in a beautiful part of our country where you don't have to look far to find water and wonderful places to enjoy the outdoors. And so it's going to get harder for all of us to stay disciplined and So how do you think we can navigate that as a community? I've seen some interesting articles of, and there was a couple articles and pictures where they've drawn out areas for make sure that people were physical distancing in parks and set up fencing. And I've seen, assuming first off, you don't know that everything you see is absolutely accurate. So I bear that in mind, but are there ways that we can sort of have a balance of enjoying the summer and still being safe?
Well, I guess I'll start, and then maybe Rob, you can help me out on that one. It's a tough question, Jackie. I think it's something that I think that everybody's asking right now. I know that I'm on a regular call with other mayors of cities across the province, and it's a big issue that we're all talking about. Is that that there is that fatigue that's there. I think part of it is how can we be creative as a city to create more space for people to be physically distant. And so certainly in your dense urban cores, certainly like for example Kingston downtown, where you have more people and there's less space, then how do you reimagine that space? And so that's is where we're looking at creating more pedestrian space, closing off Princess Street and a few other downtown streets to create more space for people to be able to walk and to spread out, so you're not confined just to the sidewalk, which in normal times works, but here to be comfortable and to feel safe, people want that additional space. So I think that's part of the challenge for us, is being able to find those forums. We talked a lot with public health certainly the last couple of months about finding ways to have green spaces and walking trails and places for people to be able to go out and get fresh air and the kind of activities that people could do and still again be safe and to be physically distant. But I think that the other piece is that I think there's a social adaptability piece that it's funny how I remember I think it was Thursday before the provincial declaration was formed, and I remember there were a couple of medical students that were coming into my office. They were wanted to talk about a political issue that was coming up to city council, and I remember I held off and I didn't shake their hand, and it was really strange. Right at that time, that was a really strange thing for me, because I would always shake people's hands when they would come into the office, and I didn't do it. Now, right? I mean, I don't even think about not shaking someone's hand. Think about, like maybe initially it was weird to kind of distance yourself from somebody else, but now it feels almost the reverse. It almost feels strange to get close. I was in the grocery store the other day, and this gentleman came right up to me in the grocery store, and it was strange, because 2 months ago I wouldn't have even thought twice about it, but when he did, I'm like, man, we got 6 feet, man. Get back.
The fines are everywhere.
So I think that, I think that's a very long answer to your question, Jack, but I think there's 2 pieces to it. One, I think is, again, and I'm really proud of the community. I think the community gets it. And I think that we've already trained ourselves, and there's, so it's become socially acceptable, to distant, and quite frankly, it feels awkward not to. So I think that that's helpful. And then the other piece is, though, how can we find other opportunities to help people to connect and still do that in a safe way? Because like you said, that human need that we all have isn't going to go away. How do we find those forums? How do we make that space available for people?
Okay. So do you have the answer to how we can do all that?
I don't know whether I've got any answers, but the kinds of conversations that I'm involved in these days and on the call, one of the things has been kind of a shift of it being dangerous or not for interactions. It's now a greater sophistication around low risk and high risk. And so for many people, maybe not everyone, and it varies a lot, depending, like I'm of a certain age and I have diabetes, so I have to be really careful what I do, where other people are not at the same kind of risk as I might be. It's not just an excuse to get Janet to do all the grocery shopping either. But when people think of golfing, if you golf in your own cart, you bring your own clubs, you don't leave them at the place, the food services are closed, you don't touch the pin, all of that type of thing. I think a lot of people say, well, that seems reasonable if you're careful. Since the good weather has arrived, I've heard lots of stories of people who go to their most trusted friend and they sit 8 feet apart just to see them face to face and have a conversation. So I think we're developing new social habits, but it won't be even across the whole of society. But I think we're developing new habits, just as we learn to step aside when the jogger came past on the sidewalk, or like all these little habits that we suddenly learned, or lining up around a grocery store as so many feet apart. So I think we'll learn that. The second part is so much what we're doing is guided by social proof. And so social proof being what you see other people doing and seem to accept as right. And so there are a number of businesses are kind of saying, have we gone too far? Is everyone so afraid of contagion and so forth that we, and everyone else is like being paranoid about it too. So have we gone too far? Is there a reasonable middle way? But if you imagine how this might change, what would happen if we had more rapid and ubiquitous testing? So then you might be able to be tested and wait for half an hour, and then you can go in with other people. What if restaurants redesigned so that they had pods of people? So instead of thinking of couples or pairs of people, you thought of, here's a family, 2 families that are in a pod together, and they're symptom-free and they know each other, they trust each other. Having a restaurant with groups of 10 or 12 is quite a different than thinking 30% full with couples. So I think there are different ways that we can look at those different techniques that, because as Brian said earlier, it's about confidence. So if you don't believe your workplace is safe, if you don't think the place you're going to go to eat or shop is safe, you're not going to go. So it doesn't matter whether public health says, yeah, you can open. It doesn't matter if the mayor says, please get out there and open because we want the economy to go. If people are afraid and they don't see other people going into work, then that's going to be hard.
Yes. I agree. Excuse me. You mentioned in your last bit about different level, about society and the impact. And I think this is becoming an awareness to me because as you just, even if you scroll through your Facebook feed and you see some people have the ability to go to a cottage on the weekend, and you know that not all your friends have that ability. So I feel like that there could be a greater division between social and economic classes that come out of how we try to navigate summer. And so I think about the people who would be first to enjoy the movies in the square, Memorial Park public pool, the cooling, the splash pads around the city, and the cooling centers that you would have set up in the heat of summer for those who may be homeless or who just aren't in an air-conditioned home. What can we do as a community to support those people?
Well, I mean, that's absolutely right, Jackie. I mean, I was immediately thinking of the technology piece. Right? When you have education go online, that's not immediately accessible to all people. Became very clear very quickly, and to the credit, I think school boards and systems have moved quickly and tried to remedy that. But again, I guess to the point that Rob had made earlier about how you see the cracks immediately. So the crack that was already there, immediately it becomes evident. I mean, I think that, it's, again, back to the point about imagining public spaces. So it's true, not everybody has a private space that they can go to enjoy, to get fresh air, to relax and be physically distant. So I think that's one of the things that's really incumbent on cities. And there's a lot of conversations happening in our communities right now about how do we reimagine those public spaces to make them welcoming. So to the point about confidence, so safe, feeling welcome, feeling open, and having those opportunities. So we've been able to keep our parks and our trails open, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to do that over the summer. Our sports fields are open now, so we're going to have like scheduled team sports, but we're trying to make as many facilities, outdoor facilities, as available as possible for people to just be able to use on their own or in small groups. I think just, again, being able to find creative ways for people to be able to relax. Obviously, our transit, trying to make sure that we can find a way that people feel comfortable and safe transit, so they've got ways to be able to get around the city to places that they want to go, able to enjoy that. So I think we do have some work to do. I think you're right, Jackie. It's not something that can be ignored, and I don't think it's something that's going to fix itself. I think it's something that has to be very intentional, but certainly is something that I know that a lot of us are talking about right now.
I would add or elaborate on that a little bit to the point that there are a lot of people who are being plunged into challenging circumstances that aren't used to being in that. On some of our community calls, and I want to be careful that this doesn't sound patronizing, but some people said there are vulnerable people who are used to every day being a struggle, and they have these challenges and they've figured out their own way of coping with it. But there are a lot of people, and as the emergency food providers talk about, they keep saying, you know, we're seeing a lot of new faces. We're seeing like hundreds more than we saw before. And these are people who are not used to spending each day wondering, where was my meal going to come from? There are people who aren't used to being employed. There are people who are not used to having to work from home with maybe a laid off partner and a couple of 3-year-olds that they have to teach on the side and so forth. So the stresses on mental health and the various types of vulnerability, whether it's food, homelessness, or mental health and well-being, they are also putting pressure on a different group of people that we aren't optimized as a system to serve. I mean, the Emergency Community Support Fund, Kingston's getting just under $1 million between United Way and Community Foundation, and that money is going out there right away. So, and that's strictly for the vulnerable sector. But what about those, you know, like the Habitat crowd? I think of the ones who are like either not that affluent, and now the river has kind of risen up for them. We have to worry about them too, I think.
Absolutely. There's no question that it's a time where we need many hands, you know, all hands on deck, or many hands make for light work. And so, you know, this video, it's typical for these talks to have hundreds of views over the coming weeks. And many Kingstonians will be listening to this. And you know, we've got, you know, a little over 10 minutes left in our hour. And I think that it's real important that we talk about what people can do to help, and what's really important for us to get out as messages. Both, you know, Rob, you have your finger on almost every group in the community through the call that you're championing, and Brian, you're participating in those calls, and you've got another conduit through the mayor's office in your work. And so, what you know, just a few remaining minutes to talk about what would you really like people to know and do. And how do you think we can help? If we're not already engaged in volunteer work, or, you know, if we're able to give, that we've chosen our ways of giving to the many things in the community. What else, you know, what do you think is important?
Well, that's a good question. You know, you've given us some good examples, Jackie, about, you know, those that are still, you know, fortunate enough that they haven't lost income, or those that you know, are able to adapt for they've just got those circumstances to be able to help, which is great. And I can tell you, I've been really inspired and overwhelmed by the number of people that have reached out to my office just wanting to be able to help, which is amazing. And I think, to Rob's point, I think that the needs are in our community are expanding greatly outside of a circle that maybe would used to define. And we do need to understand that, because I think that larger sphere, I think, will be not as obvious. I think it's a sphere that we're not used to seeing those needs. You know, I've heard a comment, I think, from a couple of individuals from social service agencies that people that aren't used to needing that help and are almost saying, well, no, you know, I'm sure that somebody else needs the help more than I do, right? And not recognize that no, that's what that's there for. So I think everything we can do to help help support and give our social service agencies and our community organizations the tools to be able to help more people. Because, you know, I feel for those agencies because fundraising is a lot harder for them. So I think that their revenues are squeezed, and yet the demands have probably never been greater. So I think they're being squeezed from both ends. And so I think that the appeal that I would have is for those that can help. If you can help financially, you know, I know that online donations, that's the best thing you can do right now is just to give those dollars, put them in the hands of those organizations. They can make those dollars, they can stretch them and do as much as they can to help as many people. And if you've got the time, and, you know, if you're a, you know, a demographic where you feel like you're lower risk and you're able to volunteer, I know that there's a real need for that. I know that there's a lot of volunteers that have had to step back. You know, particularly if they're an older demographic and they may not be comfortable or feel safe to maybe do the volunteer work they would have done before. So I know that there's a real need there as well. So, you know, I just think the world of this community. I know that there are just so many generous people. And so certainly that's something that I'm going to continue to appeal. It's been great to see what's come, but the more that we can do, the better. And this is going to be a long road. This is not just what do we do for the next month or two. This is the next 1.5 to 2 years. If we can continue to pull ahead and not get fatigued in that, I think that that'll be critical.
Rob, comment?
A couple of things come to mind on that question. One is about just stepping up to do what you can do. And there's an example from just last night that one of the people on our call, Amanda Van Haltern, who's an associate pastor at Bethel Church, and they're a fairly large church, but they hosted a Zoom call like this, and they had 5, maybe 6 members of their congregation who are in themselves experts in mental health. One works at Providence Care, 2 or 3 worked at KHSC, a couple were social counselors and so forth. But they just went on and gave tips and told, and they had lots of people tuning in. I think they were kind of exhilarated by how much interest there was in it. But these were just people who do their work and go to church, and they agreed to step up in what they knew. Another story that I really, really love is about the Rotary Club that back in March, whenever Snowbird Rotarians were about to come back and they had to quarantine for 2 weeks, the Rotary Club members said, well, how will they get groceries? So we will help kind of be we'll do the running for them until they can navigate on their own. But then that kind of grew and more people volunteered. And then St. Vincent de Paul, who was serving 350 lunches every week, whenever they couldn't have people in their facility anymore, they had to deliver 350 lunches. Well, there's a marriage between Rotary and St. Vincent de Paul, so they kind of step up. So I think once you put your oar in the water with what you can do, whether that's convening a check-in group or whether that's giving advice on mental health or whether that's doing what you're doing here tonight, we each do our part and we go along for that. So I think that's a really important part. Step in on what you can do. The other piece for me is more for leaders, and that is to really start now about how we aren't coming out of it. We're going in transition to a new way. And I know there's a lot of attachment to the past. I was talking with a businessman this morning, and he's more or less in the tourism sector. And he said, I know I've lost $1 million. There's nothing I can do to get that back. So I just have to write that off in my head and get on to what will be next. But there are a lot of things that are going to be affected. It's popular to talk about what happens if downtown really changes. Restaurants are typically hard hit in this thing. So we're a downtown entertainment district. So what happens if a lot of restaurants go? How will we reimagine what downtown will rise again and become? Workforce changes. So not everyone who's laid off is going to be hired back. Not everyone who has been laid off is going to stay where they used to work. I know a lot of people who are now kind of on a 2-month furlough are looking around for what they want to do next. So there will be that. There are people working from home that will want to keep working from home forever. And then that changes the space requirements and so forth. So there are a lot of these kind of structural issues. What will the future of tourism be in Kingston? These are longer term issues we have to look at. And I'm glad that the mayor struck his economic recovery team and is sitting on the social recovery team to look at those. You haven't spoken about that yet, Brian, but.
Well, now's your chance, Brian.
Yeah, well, you know what, that I think what you said, Rob, is so right. This is a rebuilding that's going to have to happen, and it's, you know, the part of it is, you know, dealing with the immediate crises and trying to help those that are most in need, and then you're looking at a medium term, helping people to adjust and to change and to adapt, and then you're looking at a longer term reimagining, like you said. So how do we lay that foundation? What does Kingston look like at the end of this? And I think that, you know, ultimately being able to have voices around the table on both the economic side, so very focused on, you know, the sectors that have been hardest hit in this, and it's clear from what we know is that, you know, a number of sectors in the Kingston economy are, you know, managing okay, but some have been devastated. And so how do we help accommodation and retail and restaurant and personal services and cultural sectors? How do we help them through not just the short-term crisis, but what does that reimagined sector look like, and what are the opportunities in that, right? So it's both, you know, addressing the problems, but then looking what are the creative solutions and opportunities for that. And the social services side, you know, being able to sit around that table and how all these social service agencies are all coming together and they're just talking about, you know, what do clients need, what are the needs, what's changing, you know, how are we going to think creatively about pooling our resources, how do we make those dollars go further, and then how do we advocate effectively for our community. And I think that this is going to be a key focus. I know for me, for at least the next year and a half, but that ultimately, I believe that, you know, and Jackie, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a community call that we did, and I think it was Harvey Schachter that shared this, about how one of the key indicators that shows whether how quickly and how well a community can recover after disasters is how well it works together across sectors and across silos, and, you know, being able to communicate and work together and pull together is a critical success factor. So if we've embedded that and we have that here, how do we harness that so that, you know, the way that I described to people, how do we make Kingston a leader in recovery? If communities all across the province and the country and the world are grappling with these situations, how can we lead in the midst of that and show the strength that we have here in our community?
I muted myself because the two puppies got home and I thought they might just be noisy. One of the things that you did, Brian, was develop an economic development or an economic task team, dynamic group of business owners. And so what's the intent of the group, and you know, what do you hope to achieve for the community?
Yeah, it's a great group. We've had our first meeting, and we're meeting every couple of weeks now. It's essentially it's a hub. It's a hub where you have leaders that are very respected in all of the hard hit sectors. Then you've got the city. You've got myself at the table, the city's chief administrator. You've got labor representatives there. You've got the Downtown Business Association and Tourism Kingston and KEDCO and the Chamber and all those business support organizations, and everyone's sitting around the same table. So we're all able to talk and to share. And so for me, the way I see it is that we're hearing directly on the ground, what are the challenges? And then that helps us, you know, at the city level or in other organizations that are supporting business, say, okay, what are the biggest needs? What are the biggest priorities? How do we design the right initiatives and programs to help? And then we come up with these programs, we present them to the team, and the team says, yes, that will work, but you're going to have to change this because I know that this is another key challenge in the sector, or this is what I'm also hearing is going on in my networks. And so being able to have that conversation and feedback as we go, make sure that the programs are the right things. We're focused on the right tools to be able to help people adjust, adapt, to survive and hopefully eventually to thrive just in the new normal that we're facing.
Thank you. Rob, do you have a comment to add to that?
Just one thing, I guess, is that it would be my hope for the future that people will continue to bring a good and open and compassionate heart forward in the discussions. I think we're going to have a tricky patch ahead, which is how do you balance the kind of triumvirate of business economic issues, social mental health type issues, and health issues. And how do you find the right balance of that for all of the different players and interests? It's very easy, especially if you're one of the people in pain in our community, to sort of demonize the other side. People being overly restrictive about social distancing, or people are, they just want to go and make a buck. Or it's easy to put people into stereotypical categories. I think we have to be open to continue to see people as people and approach these problems collaboratively and with a good heart, and try to see there's a great a chief said to me from the Indigenous community, he said, they were having a conflict, and he said, I don't see the friendship in your comment. And I think if we could do that, if we could keep the friendship in our comments as we work with partners and new partners and with problematic employees or problematic bosses or problematic healthcare people, if we could just keep that open heart and see the friendship in our voice, it'll see us through, I think.
Great comments. And you mentioned, both of you have mentioned that there are communities in need. And so if one of our listeners is wanting to do more than they're currently doing, who could they reach out to?
You know what, honestly, what I tell Jackie, is they can reach out to me, reach out to my office. We'd be more than happy to have a conversation and to understand better what they can bring to the table. And then we can happily connect them with a local group, organization, or individual to discuss for sure.
And pardon me, go ahead, Rob.
Well, I was just going to add from some of the other sector points of view, certainly the United Way has a COVID support page, which has great listings, as the LIN does. Public health, of course, continues to be a big resource. If you're in the cultural sector, the Kingston Arts Council has a lot of resources there to point people in the right direction. And I think probably, aside from the group that's already meeting on business, there's probably going to be in the next week or so the seminal part of a new reopening kind of team that will help, because there are a million people with questions and only so many sources to get them. So we're going to try and coordinate that as a community initiative as well.
Well, these are great initiatives, and I commend both of you just for your leadership in a very difficult time. And both of you have stepped up, like you mentioned, Rob, in ways that you could. And Brian, you've learned a new job. So congratulations. And I appreciate your leadership. And we have our favorite parting question is, what's the one thing that you're going to bring forward from your journey through this experience?
I'll jump in first. I mean, in my practice and so forth, I consider myself a student of the dynamics of change and decision-making in social networks. And so a lot of the things that either I've kind of seen in limited way with clients or with agencies or in strategic planning is suddenly writ large in this situation. So there's going to be a lot of learning there that I hope to share. And I hope that we can keep the best parts and the thrive part of resilience going after this.
Thank you, Rob. Brian.
I mean, I think for me, it's a change it's in perspective about what matters most. I think that, when you go through something like this, you quickly see what are the priorities, what really matters, and what do we sometimes maybe focus on that maybe doesn't have the same significance. Maybe we focus on some things too much and it's not enough. And I say that both on a personal level, but also on a community level as well.
Great words of wisdom. Kathy, do you have any comments before we close?
I don't think so. I wrote some notes down and kind of everything that we were saying. And, for me, talking about moving forward, it definitely is kind of taking these best practices. And Heather Haynes used the word edit when I was chatting with her. And I've really taken that to heart of what can we edit out of our life that might not need that focus, and what do we hold space for that we can maybe let go of so that we can grow in other areas. And having this time, the space in between, to really just think. And I think that that's been a blessing in amongst all of this. So I think as a community, we're coming together to see that. So I'm very proud to be a part of Kingston.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your time this evening. It was great to hear from both of you, and yet again, thank you very much for your leadership.
Absolutely.
And good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night.